Good afternoon. I'm Naveen Girishankar, the president of the Economic Security and Technology Department here at CSIS. I welcome you to our inaugural launch of our inaugural report for the Economic Security and Technology Department, Staying Ahead in the Global Tech Race, a roadmap for economic security. We're going to have two panels today with our experts from the department. I'm delighted to have Bill Reinsch, the Shoals Chair and Senior Advisor, Erin Murphy, the Deputy Director of our Expanded India and Emerging Asia's Economics Program and Senior Fellow, Hilaria Mazzocco, Deputy Director of our Trustee Chair for China Business and Economics, and Rick Rosso, Senior Advisor and Chair of our India and Emerging Asia Department or Program. We're going to have a conversation with this group, and then we'll have a second panel that comes in with our other experts that contributed to the report. Now, let me say a few words about this report before I open up for conversation. The U.S. is in a generational shift when it comes to economic policy and its role in national security. And this is largely in response to three challenges: an accelerating global technology competition, principally with China, economic dislocations domestically that really reflect gaps in economic policy over the last 40 years, and rising vulnerability to global threats and global challenges, including climate change and pandemics. And what we've seen over the last two administrations, starting with the Trump administration and dramatically during the Biden administration, is an expansion in what we can call economic security policies and strategies. Broadly, and I write about this in my introductory essay with this collection, are policies that promote productive capacities, industries of the future, whether it's chips or climate and clean technologies at home, policies that protect our sensitive technologies from dual use, dual civil and military fusion and risks on the part of the Chinese and others. So these are export controls, investment screening, sanctions, strategic tariffs, and policies that expand our partnerships with our trading partners around the world, including things like the IndoPacific Economic Framework, the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, initiatives around critical and emerging technologies around the world. We've seen an expansion in all of these over the last several years, in particular over the last 3 or 4 years. And they're coming to a head in the sense that the trade-offs and tensions between these approaches are really something that policymakers will not be able to ignore. You can put in place export controls, but that entails a revenue hit to the very companies that you need to build your industrial base. You can try to partner with allies, but absent a trade policy and a trade strategy, there are limits to how much of an incentive there is to build supply chain resilience with those partners. You can promote domestic industries with strategic public investments, but that sort of rubs some of our partners the wrong way when they're trying to build their own industrial base. And so we're coming to a point where I would argue that the only way forward is to return to what is time-tested and stress-tested, which is the drivers for technological innovation, commercialization, and scaling are competition in trusted, secure technology markets. And there's an interesting conversation about where that goes and what that looks like. So for our first panel, we're going to talk about our relationships with trading partners and with allies around the world. And let me first start with Bill. You've written eloquently over many, many years, but including in this essay, about the future of trade policy or the lack of a trade agenda now and what is needed for us to be able to deliver on economic security. So let me ask this question. What does an economic security agenda look like going forward absent a trade policy, and is there a way to go there?
Well, I think what we're going to get probably is a continuation of a lot of the themes that you've just described, which involve a lot of bumbling around and not knowing quite where to go. Part of it, though, it will depend on who wins, because they don't differ that much on some policies, but they come at the policies from very different points of view. Trump's approach is that the U.S. is a victim and of the evil foreigners trying to steal our jobs. And his job is to fix it, and his tool for fixing it is tariffs, and he's already promised many of them across the board and China specific. And he's not, historically, he's been interested in bilateral approaches to trade agreements. He's not a fan of regional or multilateral approaches. He thinks that the United States has more leverage in one-on-one conversations because we're usually bigger and can bully the other side, whereas in group exercises, he feels outnumbered. He's already said that if he's elected, he'll pull out of IPEF, and I assume that he would pull out of APEP, the American Partnership for Economic Prosperity, as well, because they're similar. I don't think that would preclude him from trying to launch individual trade negotiations. He launched some when he was in before, but you get into details and you realize that neither his agreements nor actually the Democrats' agreements are reciprocal in the historic sense. Trump's view has been that we've been giving benefits to other countries for 40 years, and now it's time for them to give back. So if you look at what he negotiated, for the most part, it's other countries making concessions to us and us agreeing not to penalize them. And on the Democratic side, if you look at IPEF, which is the main thing that they've done, you see no reciprocity, you see no market access, you see a number of things that we're asking them to do without reciprocation on our part. The asks are different. I mean, Trump's ask is more, buy more of our stuff. The Harris-Biden asks are more, treat your workers better, produce more sustainable economies, obey human rights rules, adhere to anti-corruption agreement conventions, and things like that are all important, good government things, but are also not always easy for the other countries to undertake. But both cases are the same in that they really involve us asking the other countries to do something without giving anything in return. And so I think, at least for the next 4 years, that's what you're going to see. And I don't see a real effort to try to either go back to a more conventional reciprocal approach or even to go forward with a broad multilateral approach that might involve more market access.
Thank you, Bill. And before I move to Aaron, let me just ask you, could you draw the picture as to what's happening, say, in the Indo-Pacific or in Asia more broadly with respect to trade agreements that countries are joining with the Chinese?
Well, life goes on without us. You know, I think one of the Trump assumptions is that access to the American market is so attractive that people will pay for it. And I think what we've learned is that people would like access to our market. It's big, but there are alternatives. So in Asia, you have the successor to the agreement that Trump pulled out of, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, which China has applied to join. They're next in the queue, although I don't think that the existing parties are going to go in order necessarily. But they've already added the UK, so I think that puts them up to 12 or 13 members now, and there's a lengthening list of countries that have either applied or have talked about applying. So that's going on. You have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Program, like RCEP, which includes China. It includes really all of Asia except India, which pulled out, which is a much less ambitious agreement, but it's a framework for future cooperation. You've got a host of smaller agreements going on amongst various parties, particularly in Southeast Asia. A lot of them focused on digital cooperation. So there's a lot. It's one of the, it's really the fastest growing region in the world economically, and there's a lot going on, and we're just watching.
Now, Aaron, you've written about this as well, particularly with respect to the Indo-Pacific. Bill talked about trade. You, in your essay, talk about investment in infrastructure and finance. Could you shed some light on, what's happening with respect to that, including in the Indo-Pacific economic framework, but more broadly as well?
So typically when a new U.S. administration comes into power, they have to rediscover that we're a Pacific nation. But for the Biden administration, there was no such, realization. It was acknowledged at the beginning that the Indo-Pacific is, the first among equals in terms of engagement and investment. When Trump pulled us out of TPP, I think there was an effort to really demonstrate where we were going to be economically and coming up with more frameworks. Clearly, as Bill has said, trade is not a popular thing among Republicans or Democrats, so we couldn't necessarily recreate TPP, and so the next best thing was the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. But I think another thing that really kind of shaped what was happening in the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, which is relatively similar to the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, with the exception that there was an emphasis more on partnerships and strengthening alliances, but that there is a growing $1 trillion gap in infrastructure, that the Chinese have really dominated the infrastructure landscape in the Indo-Pacific, both through its Belt and Road Initiative and its Digital Silk Road Initiative. And though administration after administration in the United States has lamented over the fact that the Chinese really are dominating here and have very frequently pointed out where the Chinese are not doing well, including on labor standards, hiring local laborers, high quality standards in terms of infrastructure and the materials going in, still did not put up an alternative. And there's been a concentrated effort to do that. And so we've seen kind of a flurry of initiatives that have come up that are really looking at the same thing. These big existential issues that are affecting the whole globe, but particularly the Indo-Pacific, like climate change and the effects of climate change. So you see both in IPEF, but also in the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, and even with agencies in the United States that are focused on these types of investments, like the DFC or the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, decarbonization and the energy transition, but also in working on infrastructure that both adapts to the effects of climate change and mitigates the effects of climate change. There's also been movements in trying to promote more engagement in ICT. On digital, the Chinese have really moved quick, fast. They're even moving away from the big infrastructure projects themselves, like ports, railroads, airports. But on digital, they've really moved quickly. But again, where is the alternative? And of course, there are other things that PGI and IPEF and other partnerships, whether it's bilateral or trilateral among the Japanese, Australians, and the US, or even the Quad, and looking at infrastructure. Decarbonization will be the main goal there. The digital side will also be up there. But it's also, how do you really support and address the needs on infrastructure, which, for better or worse, the Chinese have stepped up. And we really haven't. We come with standards. We come with, anti-corruption and better tax regimes. So it's time to actually put money in, physical, tangible projects into that.
That's an excellent point. And it's interesting because one can argue that requiring high standards without deep pockets may not be a pathway to sort of viable projects.
That's right.
And so you mentioned DFC, but could you give us a little bit more color on the scale of investments that we can expect from the U.S. Using both U.S. government tools, but also leveraging the U.S. private sector?
There's a lot of ambition, and so it's going to take deep pockets as well to do that. And if you look at the PGI statements alone, the G7 countries are supposed to come up with $600 billion within 5 years. So this was announced in 2022. And the U.S. was supposed to come up with $200 billion of that. For those of us that live in D.C. and watch government shutdowns with great aplomb, we know that the government is always threatening to shut down over budget. So I don't think that $200 billion is necessarily going to be coming from the United States, but there is language in all of these agreements about mobilizing private sector capital. Right. So the idea of creating high standards and a better enabling environment for our companies to go in and have partner and ally companies go in, I think there's a great effort there. But the U.S., through its agencies that do have its own money, it's appropriated, it's allocated, are doing multi-million-dollar projects. Now, when you compare that to what the Chinese are doing, which, I think now it's totaled up to $1 trillion, we're talking about millions and billions, but it's still going to have impact. The Development Finance Corporation, again, it has a strong focus on the Indo-Pacific. I was just at a U.S. Investment in Philippines conference this morning, also hosted by CSIS, and that the DFC has put in $92 million in SMEs, agricultural tech, and affordable housing, but they're really looking at the energy space. So we're talking about billion-dollar initiatives. One of the largest investments that the DFC has done has been in India. It was a $500 million project on First Solar to help produce locally solar panels. One, to cut into the supply chain issue with China and forced labor, but also to offer an alternative and these sorts of things. So these types of projects are getting bigger and bigger. The DFC can lend up to $1 billion on these types of investments. And then we have other agencies as well, like USTDA, XM, Millennium Challenge Corporation, which are also pooling together their investments, also with partners from Japan, Australia, that can help bring about a blended finance approach to these so that we can maximize what we have when maybe some of us can only throw in a couple million. By pulling that in, we can do bigger and better projects.
So a very interesting story when I take what Bill said and what you've said, that there's been significant efforts, number of initiatives around the world, including in the Indo-Pacific, including in other regions, delta on USG finance relative to what we've seen in the past, for sure. Perhaps without the trade instrument that that our partners would expect, but significant. And yet, where we need to go, like climbing up the mountain, there's a lot farther to go, but still there has been movement. Very interesting.
That's right.
Now let's differentiate that, maybe highlight the India case. I'm going to go to Rick, because you've spent decades now working on the US-India partnership. Give us a little bit of a sense of where we are now, particularly the last few years. Shine a light on that, and maybe contrast that with some of the challenges that Bill and Aaron talked about in the broader Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, well, and going back to your original framing, Naveen, I fully realize too, the conversation's built around U.S. economic security and what it means for the election that's coming up. And not a lot of people that have been in the trenches and the fights with India on trade and investment issues, and I'm sure Bill in his heart is nodding vigorously when I say that, but we've all kind of been there, done that. But the relationship, it is evolving quite a bit over time. So when you think about what an economic relationship with India looks like as it relates to U.S. elections and the imperatives voters are going to impart on whichever party they choose, you actually see, India investment in the United States is really starting to grow and take off. So if you wonder when are both hands going to be clapping and it's not American outbound investment or trying to get exports to India, which is a good thing, of course, when we talk about election issues, but Indian companies last year alone put almost $5 billion into the United States. And while we know like a lot of the tech investments, like TCS and HCL, but actually it's deepened quite a bit. You got auto companies. My home state of Michigan, the first new auto plant in 20 years went into Detroit with a Indian company, Mahindra. You got pharmaceutical companies, even on the backs of IRA, where an Indian firm also was one of the first out of the gates to put investments into U.S. solar manufacturing. So while the great work of DFC to put solar manufacturing there, India recognition that the United States is a growing market, and you put incentives on the table. So I think whoever wins the election, would be, I think, well advised to at least spare a minute before they start announcing any changes to the programs we got on the table, and talk not just to India, but to our big, important partners. Yeah. There's a couple of other reasons why India, has to be front of mind when we think about U.S. economic security. When you look a little further down the pathway, it is a large economic partner of the United States, and one of our 10 largest trading partners. So a significant economic partner. Also, if you think about China's ability to leverage trade as a tool to further empower itself economically, there's two countries in the world that together are going to produce 40% of global growth, China and India. Yeah. Ultimately, if we can help India insulate itself somewhat, and then to be able to, so that China tech exports and such don't have this massive market right next door that's fueling a ton of global growth, that long term is good for us as well. The last thing I'll say is, with India too, that when you get to the level of the President of the United States or the Indian Prime Minister, it's not an economic relationship, it's not a defense relationship, it's not a people to people. They have to look at the entire ledger. Mm-hmm. And so we might have to give a little bit on the economic and commercial front to India in exchange for the kind of things they're doing with us in the military field, in interoperability in the field right now, that 20 years ago had been inconceivable. So, if we take some commercial integration off the table in areas India's interested in, they might be more reluctant to work with us on some of the military stuff that has an even more concrete and direct impact on security in the Indo-Pacific. So, yeah, there's a lot to consider, and India, along with other countries that have that kind of big heft in play, to at least spare a minute to consult before announcing big programmatic changes would be in whoever wins best interest, I think.
Well, thank you for highlighting that. It struck me that another country that's a really good example of two-way trade and investment over the last few years is Korea, South Korea. I was looking at the numbers of billion-dollar South Korean investments in the United States, in clean tech, in EVs, in EV batteries, and it's at historic levels. And so even though we don't have sort of a trade agenda similar to what we have seen in the past, we do see economic integration taking place in new ways, and partly because those promote policies are attracting investment at home. Those partnership policies that we're talking about are creating new opportunities. And so this is it's a complex picture, but it's one that, as you said, it's like the sweater. Don't take the thread out of the yarn out of it and have it unravel without knowing what it is. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Let's shift this conversation because, Ilaria, you wrote eloquently about clean technologies and competitiveness. And so you said, well, don't forget the even bigger picture, which is around China, and thinking about that relationship maybe in a different way. So could you share some of the insights that you wrote about in your essay?
Yeah, thank you. And I think actually it's great that you bring the example of Korea because, of course, a lot of that investment has been in clean tech, as you said, right? And I think there's been this interesting shift under the Biden administration where the U.S. has started actually providing stronger incentives. And I think, Rick spoke about how Indian companies have also been responding to those in the clean tech sector. Really, I think, changing a little bit the dynamics on the competitiveness side of things. Of course, we've seen much more on the protect side of things, but I think it really highlights the trade-offs and the challenges when it comes to rethinking policy on clean tech. And the reason why that is that it's undeniable that China and Chinese companies are clearly in the lead. So at this point, a lot of the R&D, a lot of the IP is in the hands of Chinese companies. They've been making these products, and when we're talking about the mature clean tech technologies, we're talking about electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels. But of course, there's next generation technologies where the competition is a bit more open at the moment, but certainly much more, even more important in some ways. But Chinese companies now are able to produce these products at scale, which means at cost. Of course, they've benefited from enormous subsidies, and there's a big sort of international debate around that. But I think, what I was arguing is I think we should be thinking a little harder about what the pieces that are still missing to make these industries even more competitiveness in the U.S. and in partner countries, right? So I think, there is a bit of a tension between national security, impulses or concerns, which of course I think are absolutely important, and we should be making sure that whatever policies and incentives are provided actually, are consistent with standards that are strong on environmental, human rights, and national security standards. But there is potentially that impulse to completely separate value chains and have zero reliance on Chinese technology. That's going to be extremely challenging. Extremely costly. And so I think a more targeted approach moving forward is to, one, be a lot more clear-eyed about what are actually the strategic priorities, what are actually sort of strategic threats, and then also where there may be actually opportunities for some sort of reliance on Chinese technology, which may be licensing deals, maybe some sort of joint ventures. I think there should be much more creative thinking around that. And in fact, companies are already doing this, right? It's just that it's not entirely clear how much this is welcome in the United States, and there's still a very active debate over this. And I think that makes it harder for American companies when they don't know exactly what the red line is and where they stand.
The one thing both parties can agree on, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, it's important to think that also foreign companies that are investing in the United States from partner countries, right, may have some reliance on those Chinese value chains at some point in their own value chains, right? So I think we should be thinking about what is actually a threat and what is, maybe something that we can accept in order to achieve those other goals, right? Which are that competitiveness in these industries that we know are going to be central globally, and also our climate targets, which I think are important, right? And I think we shouldn't forget that climate and decarbonization do matter, right? Just today, right, we're still seeing the toll of the deaths in Spain due to terrible flooding that has been linked to climate change, right? It's over 150 people have been confirmed dead, right? So we should be thinking about the actual security implications also of climate change and how we should be addressing that.
But that leads you to where I think we're stuck now with conflicting goals. We can't achieve them all at the same time. If you look at the U.S. economic security agenda, we're trying, in the current administration, is trying to encourage de-risking from China, which is a security goal. They're focusing on reshoring, bringing jobs and manufacturing back here. And they want to deal with the climate by accelerating the transition to green technologies. And what I think we're learning is you can't do all of those at the same time. If you're going to reshore, you're going to slow down the green transition. If you're going to put guardrails on, or not guardrails, local content restrictions on solar panels, for example, or dumping duties on solar panels, which I have to say from a trade perspective are entirely justified because they're offsetting the subsidies that are against WTO rules. But if you do that, you slow down that particular goal to make it hard to meet it. And I think the current administration, I think, is focused probably more on reshoring at the expense of the other goals. I rather suspect that the Trump administration will do the same thing. But the fundamental problem is I don't think we can do all those things at the same time. Or am I wrong about that?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think then also there is an issue where I think we want to make sure that our economic security agenda actually achieves its goal of integrating us further with countries that we consider partners and allies, economically speaking, and reduce reliances on other countries. But if those other countries, our partners and allies, are in some ways integrating more with China, what does that mean, right? Are we becoming more insulated? And I think we're looking at Europe. That is a potential risk that might happen, where we have been failing to create those sort of shared standards or agreements, right? The global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum, which I know Bill has written a lot about, for example. But at the same time, we're seeing more Chinese investment in clean tech in Europe. We're seeing more European companies in the automotive sector investing in Europe. And you might end up seeing even more integration along those value chains, right? So what does that mean for our goals, and are we meeting those economic security goals?
One of the things I wrote about in my paper was that if you're looking for a way out of the trade negotiation box, where if you don't want to do market access, what can you do instead? One of the things you can do is focus on standards and regulation and either harmonization or mutual recognition, which is what you were talking about. And I think the frustrating thing is we've been trying to do that with the Europeans for 40 years with very little success. People who've listened to me on other occasions know there's the golden opportunity to tell the chicken story, but I won't tell the chicken story, but it's an illustration of, nobody wants sick chickens, but we can't seem to agree. We have a common goal, but we can't seem to agree on the means of getting there. They want to do it their way, we want to do it our way, and that gets in the way of achieving these other objectives. I think you're exactly right about that.
Yeah. Bill, since you have the floor there, let's ask you to reflect on what's happening in some of the developing countries, not only in India and the Indo-Pacific, but a little bit more broadly. I know you've written in the past, including about AGOA coming on stream in the future, in the next year, and what AGOA 2.0 looks like. Tell us, is there a pathway back to trade? And is critical and emerging technology a potential angle to get back to trade around particular verticals?
Well, I have foreign visitors who come in to see me all the time, and they ask that question. When are we going to get back to a normal trade agreement, meaning the way we used to do it? And my answers tended to be somewhere between 4 years and never. Because I don't think either candidate right now is disposed to go down that road. Mm-hmm. And it's ironic because I think they appreciate, certainly Harris appreciates the importance of AGOA, for example, mm-hmm. and the importance of stronger economic relations with developing countries. In fact, one of the public rumors lately is she set up a little working group specifically to deal with Africa policy going forward, which I think is a good thing. But the challenge is going to be how do you approach that in a way that's mutually beneficial? A lot of the rhetoric, I think, right now about Africa and really about AGOA is how can we use it in a way to make it easier for us to extract minerals from these countries that have them? I mean, that is in our interest. It's not necessarily in the interest of African nations simply to be extractive economies. They want to develop more value added, and they want to refine the minerals. They want to manufacture the products that contain the minerals. They want to move up the value added chain like developed countries has done. Unless we are offering those kinds of alternatives, and this is something that I think Aaron can probably comment on about feasibility or what tools we have to do that, unless we're offering that kind of thing, I'm not sure how far we're going to get. That's one problem. The other problem is this new tendency, which comes from the left wing of the Democratic Party, to add sort of value choices on top of AGOA requirements. So it's not about trade. It's, are you respecting human rights? Are you paying your workers the right amount? Are you producing a sustainable economy? You know, are you passing domestic laws that organize your society the way that we think you should organize your society? And IPEF had a good bit of that in it too. And I think for the other countries, that's frustrating. One, because it's patronizing, it's sort of neo-colonialism, but the other reason is that doing those things, which are good things, are not easy in these countries. They're expensive, and I think you alluded to that earlier, and you know, they cost money. Second, they are disrupting a lot of iron rice bowls, of traditional arrangements that take place in these economies. They may be corrupt arrangements, but they're arrangements. And disrupting that is politically complicated and expensive in a different way. And one of the dilemmas that the United States is running into is other countries ask, well, if you want us to do all that, what are you offering us? You know, where's the incentive? And that goes back to the beginning. We're not offering incentives. Maybe money is an incentive, but that I defer to Aaron on that.
Yeah, money and promises of investment, but you know, this is really where the conversation has to include people talking to each other, not past each other, and that's certainly helping. I mean, you know, I think that these initiatives are coming from a good place, but is missing one key question or one key conversation with the private sector in terms of what is going to make them mobilize their capital to go into these investments. When you look at agencies like the DFC or TDA or even MCC, they're investing in low and lower middle income countries, which are inherently risky. And in talking to private sector companies, they're like, yeah, you can de-risk the hell out of these countries, but we're still not going to go there. People are investing in Europe, they're investing in the United States, and it's partly because of rule of law, stability, and whatnot. Now, these initiatives are getting there. And I think when these conversations are happening from government to government, especially with whether it's IPEF Pillar 4 or in talking about standards through the Blue Dot Network. The idea that when these things are in place, this creates an enabling environment for that investment. So it's almost like the promise of money. I mean, there is investment going in. DFC can invest with local companies. It's not just investments with an American flavor. The Japanese are a lot more flexible in terms of their investment instruments, that they don't necessarily have to include a Japanese company all the time. The Australians have been quite flexible. But yeah, it's a promise of this investment, but it's probably a long way off. And then just, you know, getting to an understanding of, is this what the country needs? Is this what they want? Obviously not supporting any vanity projects, but how are we going to try to get all this together?
Yeah. I hear a few things here. One is that, well, we need to find a way to trade, back to trade, where it's going to provide an incentive. Two is, as you've said a couple of times here, what are viable financing arrangements that actually make it worthwhile long-term investors making long-term bets in these countries? Here's a question for you. What's the role of the country in terms of reform of sectors and reform of the enabling environment or the investment climate to grow the opportunity set of viable projects and also to attract investment? What's the pathway to that? Because I wonder whether that's kind of a missing piece here. Now, the good news is, if you talked about Africa, One of the things that I found quite interesting is that things are changing. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area provides some opportunities, some motivations for reform and integration on the continent, which may change the calculus of what we can do with our partners there. At the same time, there are some things happening in Asia as well. So there's a question of what reforms are happening in countries that make it worthwhile for private investors. Then there's also the question that things are changing and the world is changing around them, meaning, the point that Rick has made, that there's the China alternative, and are we providing them? Any thoughts on what countries can do themselves or what we can expect countries to do in terms of reform?
I mean, governments play a critical role in this, and showing good faith in terms that once foreign direct investment comes in, it is protected. It's not up for nationalization. It's not up for selling off or having opaque terms in how its partnerships are set up. Like you're required to have a joint venture partner. We've seen some countries around Southeast Asia start opening up a lot of sectors. The Philippines, again, this is on my mind from the discussion this morning, and that during the Duterte administration, they did a constitutional amendment to the Public Services Act, which opened up sectors that were once completely off limits to foreign businesses. This is a huge step for the Philippines in opening up their market quite a lot more, and that they have an array of sectors that are both critical to the United States and our national security and economic security, and to theirs, and can only benefit the folks on the ground. And that includes semiconductors, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and tech and IT. So, there are opportunities there. Indonesia has also taken steps in terms of reforming its state-owned enterprises and making them a bit more business-friendly. Vietnam has gone through several openings, but this one seems to be sticking, and trying to promote policies that will enable the business environment, and that includes, tax reform, but in terms of opening up these sectors to foreigners. And I think for the most part around Asia, that has been one of the primary impediments. Of course, there are other concerns as well, and that comes in maintaining U.S. standards that are required, whether it's through FCPA or the UK Bribery Act or any other sort of regime that you have to follow. And then in some of these countries, sanctions issues, which are going to grow increasingly more complicated with export controls, but also, the ever-growing specially designated and blocked nationals list from OFAC. That doesn't necessarily affect most countries. I don't see people running to invest in Myanmar these days. Alas, but it's not a good place. But that's a great example of it's also dangerous, and these things do become unstable fairly quickly. But for what would also help, I think, in some of these is for the U.S. government to be a lot more clear as to what these controls, what these sanctions are. That really puts the onus, and that also includes things like the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, in how far do you need to go down your value chain to provide transparency in what all the places are. I think it's a lack of understanding of how complex supply chains are. And so local governments play a role in that. Local businesses play a role in that. But the U.S. government also plays an incredibly significant role in providing clarity and not just putting the onus on businesses, because that's just a risk they're probably not willing to take. They'll invest right out and say, well, you know what, where I don't have to worry about that is Nevada or Pennsylvania or France.
Right.
So
there's the rub. That's very interesting. I want to come back to Rick, because I want to just keep on this question of reform in countries. You've written and talked about India as a partner, and the thing that just to highlight for folks who are viewing this, your program has this incredible footprint at the state level in India, which you've been building now for several years, where a lot of reforms should and are taking place. But shed a light on that, including on India as a partner, because if the glue that makes this stick is commercial relationships, private sector to private sector through time, a lot of that is going to depend on the enabling environment. Tell us the India story.
Yeah, Aaron kind of hinted at it. In India, when you think about what makes the business environment function well, it comes at two levels. The level everybody knows relatively well, which is what's happening at the national level, setting tariffs, taxation rates, foreign investment limitations, not dissimilar to some of the powers the U.S. federal government has. But, if you talk about a manufacturing company, the kind of investments India is trying to win right now, most of the regulations and business practices they need to be cognizant of are things that state governments control. India has 28 states. Of those 28 states, there's probably only 2 or 3 today that wake up every day and think, this is my state's moment to try to grab some of that investment from Ilaria and bring it home. Part of that is because, you know, the political drivers at the state level, most voters still live in non-urban environments. And they don't believe like a modern economy is something that they'll touch. So the voter interest at the state level tend to focus on basic agriculture, subsidies, things along those lines. Investing in cities, investing in modernization, investing in functioning power grids, water, sanitation, you know, the kind of things that investors need to go in and invest is still the exception rather than the norm among the 28 states. Some states, you know, you get a leader that comes in and prioritizes it, but voters don't care. And so they have a pretty good chance of getting voted out 5 years later. Now you've seen with the Biden administration, you know, we talked about the thrust and drive to bring manufacturing back to the United States. India is fairly unique in that you see the White House directly calling on American companies in high-tech industries to take a chance that maybe they weren't looking at to make investments in India. Look at last year's joint statement when Prime Minister Modi came. You know, semiconductor firms and all these sectors where they weren't seriously considering India yet. But at the nudging of the government, they took another look. India was willing to craft some boutique infrastructure to land those investments. So it's a high energy kind of environment to get a few big investors to make announcements. But you're not going to get that kind of love and attention if you're Bob's pipe maker in Minnesota. You know, there you're kind of going at it alone. You got a flail depending on the power grids and the place you're looking to invest in and things like that. So the reforms, you know, you see the government can hand choose certain sectors and investors, and it looks like they might be able to make some of those work. But to really attract the large number of suppliers and medium-sized companies that don't have the $1 million a day lawyers to fight their legal battles, that's where like reform becomes doubly important, and it's still lagging for the most part at the state level.
Fascinating, fascinating.
You know, when if I can just add, when I represented big companies, what I learned for them is at the 40,000 meter level, what they look for when they're making an investment decision, they got lists. You know, we talked to one company actually has a list of 18 things that they check off. The big 3 are rule of law, policy stability, and a dispute resolution mechanism that is efficient, objective, and transparent. And because there are always commercial disputes, no matter where you are, even with the best of intentions. Those are the big ones. You want to be in a country where there are laws, you know they're adhered to, you can have reasonable expectations about what's going to happen, that you have policy stability, you know there are elections, parties change, policies change, but they don't change from 0 to 100. They change from 3 to 7, you know, in a narrower range. And you want to have that dispute settlement process. There's a whole bunch of other things, most of which Rick just mentioned, like tax policy and things like that. Zoning it turns out to be a big issue, many of which are local government issues that matter when it comes to a specific transaction. But I think the large decision is, are we going to go into Nigeria, just to pick one, for example? It begins with, I think, those big 3 questions.
And those are, in a way, almost timeless and universal.
Yeah.
But the question I have when I listen to this conversation, now I'm going to come back to Ilaria in a second here, but the question I have is, in the environment we're in today, where there needs to be a strong domestic rationale for what the U.S. does abroad, like is it going to lead to increased competitiveness, U.S. jobs in the heartland, not just on the coasts, et cetera, et cetera. There needs to be a strong U.S. rationale, and it needs to be a pathway back to tools that allow us to actually give countries an incentive, which means to some extent market access, to some extent, you know, scalable investments, and basically a pathway to long-term two-way commercial relationships, the kind of thing you're talking about in India. And so here's the question. Is technology and critical and emerging technology value chains the rationale, the pathway, the driver for this conversation? It has a clear national security rationale for the U.S. It's something that countries are interested in because they want to be part of the next wave of disruptive technologies, and in technologies that they can drive productivity and enhancements for them. And it's actually very clear what we're talking about in terms of the sectors. And Obviously, there's several of these technologies, but at least it gives a lever to actually move, both in terms of domestic reform, but also what the U.S. can do. So that's like a prompt to ask you. I'm going to ask you go around, and then I want to end with Ilaria. But
yeah, there's three things. When you think about India's drive to localize manufacturing, the Make in India program launched 10 years ago. Three big drivers, and I think what you're talking about checks two of them, which is pretty important, right? India needs to create a lot of jobs. A lot of people, half the labor force is still in basic agriculture. They're going to move to cities over the next 20 years, and there's nothing there for them right now. So creating jobs for people that don't have a lot of skills. And that's where tech won't be such a big help, because a lot of the sectors we're looking at, they're not going to be big hiring.
Yeah.
But trade deficits, we have a 3% trade deficit as a percent of GDP? India's is 10, 12% some years. So the drive on localizing and reducing the trade deficit, is and a lot of that is it's oil and tech. And so if localizing tech investments can help ease the trade deficit, that'll certainly be a significant driver. And the third is national security. India's seen other countries. You don't care whether China's going to embargo soap exports, but you do care if they're going to embargo critical minerals or things along those lines. So localizing, super important. So I think, when you think about the three big boxes, two of them are directly checked. And so I think India's going to be on board. Whatever we can do to lash ourselves together and make sure that we have that stability and strength.
Excellent. Any thoughts on this, on critical and emerging technology as the lever? And then I'm going to come to Ilaria.
I'm not sure I'm in the same place on that. They're enabling tools.
Yeah.
But there are also sectors where there are very high barriers to entry, high capital barriers and high skill barriers. If India has a thriving software industry, and there's something they can build on and do a lot with. If you go to other developing countries, they don't have that. They don't have that there, and putting it there would be very expensive. And I think that's not the first place that tech companies are going to look. Historically, investment in developing countries has tended to focus on cheap labor, basically, and which is we've lost a lot of jobs because of outsourcing or offshoring with lower labor costs in mind. The tech sector is not a cheap labor sector, and I think that if you want to stimulate investment in countries that are largely rural, largely agricultural, you probably need to start somewhere else.
And so let me throw something at that, which is it's a good point. Think about this. If you think of technology investments two-way, and you take the digital agenda in Africa, for example, the digital backbone is not purely a terrestrial activity. It requires satellite services, which is a space commerce play for the United States. And so this is an interesting conversation and set of negotiations, perhaps, with some countries. I think the digital transformation with Africa agenda is around this, which is that what can we do on satellite services where the U.S. and U.S. companies can contribute to the digital connectivity agenda in Africa, right? So that's like a way in which U.S. exports become critical for a development agenda that is important to a number of African countries. I think you could probably tell the story in other places as well. I wonder if, Aaron, you have any could shed some light on this. I know the digital agenda is also important in the Indo-Pacific.
It is, and I think ASEAN countries really stand to benefit the most and definitely see this. One, because they have the industries there. If it's not just been electronics manufacturing, but also trying to get ahead in terms of technology. China itself has even moved some of its manufacturing chains into Southeast Asia, the United States has, but then that belies the tension as well in terms of the United States and its national security, foreign policy, and economic security priorities run into tension with its own domestic needs as well. It's, how much are we investing here? How much are we investing overseas? We want to promote American technology, U.S. companies, U.S. jobs, but there again, there is a shared priority there in terms of it's better to have friends than enemies. At least I like to think so. And so by investing in these countries that are constantly seeking some sort of economic acknowledgement for the United States, this is certainly one way to do that and also get them on side in terms of standards. And that doesn't just go for hardware, software, but the rules and regulations that govern that. We're kind of at the beginning, it feels like, in terms of our digital trade and digital policy conversations here, how the US is going to tackle emerging technologies, critical technologies. How do we put in the policies in place that promote entrepreneurship, but also protect people and our information? And I think that's also a conversation to have with our partners and like-minded and investment destinations overseas, so that we're all kind of on side there. Again, I think ASEAN stands to benefit from the most, would definitely probably agree with you. It's rapidly urbanizing. And I think that connectivity piece is also critically important, especially for the maritime countries, because they're if I can say this word, archipelagos, there we go. And to try, and even though most of them are online, you know, they're at the whim of climate crisis and volcanoes in the case of Tonga, if you're looking at the Pacific Islands, but satellite technology, subsea technology, data centers. So it will demonstrate both that tension for domestic and foreign policy, but also, you know, where there are opportunities too.
Yeah. Certainly a period of significant ferment on how the U.S. can partner with allies and friends around the world, particularly on this set of issues. But Ilario, you reminded us in your essay about don't forget the following. There is value in competing. That's how you innovate technologies. That's how you commercialize. That's how you scale. And that China is both adversary but also competitor because it's competing in these. And let's face reality. Are we willing to, able to compete so that economic security doesn't become a poor excuse for protectionism? So can you bring us back to this topic? Because in a sense, across all of this, that's the core issue. Are we able to compete? What do we need to compete? We need to get in markets, take risks, and take the risk that we might fail, or individual companies. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, right, in many cases where the underlying discussion here is innovation, right? We're talking about, yes, you know, partnerships, but we're also talking about technologies, and ultimately you need to have something that you're actually being able to provide, right? And I think it's worth mentioning that we're in a moment where most countries are trying to engage in some sort of industrial policy at some level, right? And so you're seeing a lot of emerging markets, they're trying to use some tools, maybe sometimes investment and trade tools very creatively. India certainly has done that, in addition to maybe other, you know, reforms that might attract more investment, right? But there may be other tools they're using as well.
Do it because you love it, or do it because we'll force you?
Exactly, right? And you're seeing a lot of that in a lot of, you know, Indonesia has certainly done a lot of this. In Latin America, you know, there's certain experiments that are they're underway there as well. And I think, you know, Chinese companies are in many cases engaging with this directly, right? And so we're seeing Chinese companies, for a variety of reasons, are starting to expand investment in manufacturing in the clean tech, and especially in the EV and battery space and along the value chain. And that is often in response to what the governments of these countries want, right? They're seeking those investments. That's something we've been speaking of, right? And these companies are filling a gap, and they're coming in, they're providing the type of technologies that often these governments want, right? So next generation energy technologies that help them with the energy transition, and that, you know, may insulate them also if there's a shock with the, you know, demand for internal combustion engine vehicles or, you know, fossil fuels, et cetera. So I think that's worth remembering. That it's, you know, that yes, there is this sort of geostrategic competition, and yes, there's been, you know, a lot of sort of Chinese involvement that may not be really desirable or desired by the countries that receive it, but also there is these sort of very competitive products that are being provided by Chinese companies and very desirable investments. And rather than just saying, well, that's bad, you shouldn't accept that, I think the US government should be actually thinking more creatively about how to partner with US companies. And that, though, gets back to that innovation, right? Are American companies actually producing the types of things that are needed globally? And I think that's an open question in clean tech, right? And I think the IRA was a good start, but I think there should be more thinking about, you know, globally, what does this mean? And maybe it also needs to, you know, from an economic strategy, economic security point of view, maybe it's not just US companies, right? Maybe there's partner countries that have those sectors. And maybe there needs to be a non-economic but more political discussion about what that means. So I think those are, you know, those are very complicated issues, but I think it's worth keeping that in mind.
Excellent. Let me just ask you one more thing, because I just want to make sure folks who are listening who need to understand this, that they hear this from you, which is that there's only so far one can go in terms of tit-for-tat export controls. We'll talk about that in the next session. Tit-for-tat subsidy wars because of choke points. And so just in your area that you're studying right now on EVs and on clean tech, tell us a little bit more about the choke points that China has on the US and why it is important to perhaps explore what a floor could look like, because you can't go ad infinitum down this road.
Well, I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that just protective measures have not been very successful, right? I think Bill's probably been following the solar sector for a long time, right? Just including putting in tariffs has not really been very helpful in building a U.S. solar industry, right? The IRA has done more because it's provided actual incentives to building it domestically. So I think there's that, right? That if you want to actually diversify, you need to do more than just sort of input trade barriers. The second point is, I think actually thinking about choke points, we want to think about what is a real choke point and what is, more of a, well, we would like more jobs in this industry, right? So is solar really a strategic choke point issue for the United States, or is it more something about, we want to make sure these value chains aren't tainted by human rights violations, and we want more jobs in the United States, right? I think those are slightly different issues, right? Critical minerals, probably more of a choke point there, right? Yeah. And so we should be thinking more about where do we get these? Where do we source them? Are there other countries? But there again, maybe if a company is licensing technology from a Chinese company to process those minerals in a third country, is that as much of a risk as, a Chinese company processing it in China? I think we should be thinking about this and engaging with it. And of course, policymakers are, but I think that should be part of the broader conversation, just rather than just saying, like, if any Chinese company has touched anything, then that's a national security risk. Again, I don't think that's helpful, ultimately, right? And we have finite resources, and we should be thinking about what we can do to actually, get us to a point where we are really achieving that, the goal of having more innovative companies, having a more prosperous economy, and a more, a resilient economy as well.
Excellent. I mean, this is an important reminder that we need to be very practical as we approach partnerships with countries to drive U.S. competitiveness at the same time in a world in which, geostrategic competition is a real thing, and it can have impacts on sectors, it can have impact on economies, it obviously has impact on individual firms. And so, I have 2 minutes left before we go to the next session, but I want to use this to plug what I think our department is going to be doing over the next year, which I think is quite exciting, which is looking at, there are a lot of net tech assessments in town, but what we're interested in looking at is how do the innovation ecosystems of China and trading partners and the US and trading partners stack up against each other in some of these technology areas we've been talking about? And do they provide incentives for innovation and commercialization? Do they allow for companies to enter and fail, and then through that identify, and through the discovery process, what are technologies that could be valuable for our economies and other economies? And so we're very interested in picking up from this report and going into further research as we go forward, whether it's on India or the Indo-Pacific or Europe, Africa, and other countries. So I really want to thank all of you for joining this panel. We're going to take a 5-minute break, audience, and come back for the next panel, which will really be on protect measures and, importantly, promote, which is the U.S. domestic industrial policy agenda. So with that, I thank you all, colleagues, and we'll be back shortly.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to part 2 of our session today on staying ahead of the global tech race, a roadmap for economic security, which is the launch of our inaugural report at the Economic Security and Technology Department here at CSIS. I'm Naveen Girishankar, and I'm joined with a second group of my colleagues here in the department. I'll introduce them shortly. Just so those who may have missed part 1, we talked about U.S. partnerships, commercial and technology partnerships around the world, competition with China, which is really one of the pillars of economic security, which is partnership measures. And in this session, we're going to talk about the 2 other ones which are critical, which have been really the basis for an explosion of innovation in policy over the past few years. Those are protect measures like export controls, which we'll talk about today, but there are also investment screening and strategic tariffs. And then we're going to talk about promote measures, which are industrial strategy investments in industries of the future, chips, clean technologies, climate technologies. And so I have with me my colleagues, leading experts in their fields. Greg Allen, who is the director of the Vadvani Artificial Intelligence Center. He's written extensively about AI and export controls, and so happy to have Greg here with us. Sujay Shivkumar, who is the leader of Renewing American Innovation Program, who will speak about chips. Joseph Maikat, who runs our Energy Security and Climate Change Program. And Bharat Haridas, who will be speaking about export controls as well. He's part of our economics program here at CSIS. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to start out with Greg. Greg, you've written extensively, but importantly, a great synthesis of a lot of the things you've written about on export controls in the essay that we put out, in the collection of essays. Tell us, you talked about October 22 and how this was really a kind of a shift, an inflection point in U.S. economic policy. And I think the way you described it was a grand historical turning point. Tell us what you meant by that and why it was so important and where we are.
Sure. So in October of 2022, there was, in my view, a second, as you said, turning point in geopolitics. The first had already happened earlier that year. Russia's invasion of Ukraine hardly needs any further description. But in October of that year, the Biden administration launched a policy whereby they were restricting the sale, the export of advanced chips for training AI models to China, as well as restricting the software, the equipment, and even the components used to make that equipment to China so that China could not domestically produce those same AI chips that we were no longer willing to sell. This was a big move in many ways. While there had been export controls under the Trump administration previously, most of those were as a law enforcement measure. Mm-hmm. This Chinese company broke sanctions exporting stuff to Iran, and so we're going to restrict exports to them as a law enforcement punitive measure. Mm-hmm. The Biden administration's export controls were on a strategic level. Mm-hmm. We are trying to drive outcomes in China's AI sector, and particularly the civil-military fusion relationship between their commercial companies and their military AI sectors. Now, it's just one policy, but I identified it as a turning point because it was a reversal of 25 years of trade and technology policy that we had had towards China. So previously, there were restrictions on the type of, for example, semiconductor manufacturing equipment that could be exported to China, but it was on a sliding scale. As the overall technology got better, we would not sell the best of the best to China, but as the best of the best improved, we would sell 2 nodes earlier to China on a sliding scale. With this policy, the Biden administration said, we're not only no longer going to help you progress, we're going to actively try and reverse the state of the art as it already exists in China. There was fabs in China that were producing, China's best chips that this policy sought to shut down. Mm-hmm. And that was a remarkable departure from the prior 25 years of trade and technology policy. And that was a policy that started with chips and AI.
Mm-hmm. Now tell us where we are now with export controls, because what that's led to is significant expansion in the use of export controls in the way you've described. Mm-hmm. What's your view on where we are right now with respect to the implementation of those?
So from my perspective, it was a big strategic decision. You're really reorienting your relationship to China as an economy. And for such a shockingly large strategic move, I think there's been a real gap between the policy and the budget. Because strategically, you're saying it is no longer in our interest to allow American companies to assist Chinese companies and the Chinese military in making progress in AI and semiconductor technology. So you would think that if we have this big reorientation of our policy against China, we would have the resources to back up enforcement of that. But in reality, the agency that is responsible for enforcing export controls, which is the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce, their budget is a couple $100 million, and a few hundred people work there in the enforcement division. And they're responsible not just for enforcing the AI and semiconductor export controls, but all dual-use export controls. And think about what has happened to the budget of Russian smugglers since Russia invaded Ukraine. It hasn't gone down. Think about what has happened to the budget of Chinese smugglers since this AI chip export control policy has been put in place. It has massively, massively expanded. We don't have hard numbers because smugglers don't publish budgets, but I think it's perfectly reasonable to say maybe a 10x increase in the resources that they have available to them to proceed with smuggling operations. And the BIS budget has gone down in inflation-adjusted terms. And so that's what I identified in the piece, a major disconnect between policy and strategy.
Excellent. So just one more question.
Sorry, between strategy and budgets, I should say.
Yes. So I had never heard about the budget for smugglers, but that's a really interesting way to talk about it. Let me ask you, just for folks who don't know, give us a little bit more color on what BIS does that requires more budgets. Like, what are these people doing?
Sure. So the Bureau of Industry and Security is where you go to get permission to export an item that is identified in the Export Administration Regulations, the EAR, as requiring a license, right? So if you want to sell stuffed animal toys to China, you don't need to go ask the government permission for that, unless you want to sell them to North Korea or something like that. But in general, you can just go engage in those commercial transactions. But for a licensed technology, a technology that falls upon the Commerce Control List, a list of all these fancy technologies, you do have to apply for a license. So the Bureau of Industry and Security is responsible for maintaining that list, identifying what technologies require a license. Then they're responsible for reviewing license applications, saying that this company wants to sell this item to this customer in this country, and we should allow that or we should not allow that. And then they're also responsible, in partnership with some other agencies, for enforcing that, to make sure that the licenses that we approved actually resulted in goods being sold to the people who were authorized to buy them, or that folks who exported goods without applying for a license, that they're actually not able to make those transactions. It's a really tough job. I mean, they're responsible for policing literally trillions of dollars in US trade, and they've got hundreds of people doing that job.
Yes, that's a really great perspective. Now, Bharat, you have cut your teeth at CSIS on looking at the enforcement and the effectiveness of these tools, including the risks of leakage and transshipment. But could you, and you kind of elaborated on that in your essay. So could you, just teeing off from what Greg said, tell us about what the challenges are with the implementation of export controls?
Yep, I think great points by Greg. I think if we're trying to score the report card of export control performance over the last 2 years, credibly, the best we can say is that the results have been mixed. So on one hand, I think critics have been perhaps too eager to seize on selective lapses and failures and declare the entire framework a complete failure. I think that's harsh. I think that's overly simplistic. On the other hand, certain proponents, I think, have been too quick to declare a victory, and I think that is overly simplistic. The truth is always somewhere in the middle. I think when we discuss export control evasion, we need to meaningfully distinguish between what is overtly illegal, like outright smuggling, and also perhaps creative circumvention techniques. So on paper, these technically do not flout export control laws, but they do subvert the intent and spirit of export control laws, and I'll explain more later. So for the first group, the blatantly illegal, I think the evidence is increasingly clear. We've now seen investigative reports showing evidence of large-scale smuggling operations with single bulk orders of over $100 million. And this includes not just thousands of advanced AI chips, this also includes entire servers, which is what you need at a data center level to train large-scale AI models. And I think the interesting thing is that they're being sold at a premium of just 20 to 25% above retail prices with impossibly short delivery times. And I think this hints at a concerning level of confidence in both the supply chain and distribution networks for smugglers. Now, the second half, which I think is more interesting than the smuggling side, is that the things that are technically on paper not illegal. So export controls, as Greg mentioned, were intended to be a narrowly scoped, targeted exercise, and so they're aimed at only leading-edge production in China. So what that means, for example, is that SMIC or SMIC, which produces most of the advanced AI chips for Huawei, their leading-edge fabs are subject to export controls. But on the other hand, their legacy fabs, which produce mature nodes or mature chips, they are not subject to export controls. But one interesting thing was I recently saw a report by SemiAnalysis, and if you were to look at satellite reports or photos, you will see that actually the legacy and leading edge chips are connected by a wafer bridge. There's an overhead track connecting both buildings. So are we really to believe that there's no transfer of equipment or tools between both sides? And this is only the single most egregious example. There are many other instances of other Huawei affiliates or upstream suppliers that are not currently captured by the entity list. And there's also some comical examples, for example, and Greg might be familiar. So CXMT, which produces memory chips in China, so initially their 18nm half pitch was subject to 2022 export controls. And what did they do? They decided let's change the name of the 17nm chip to 18.5 of 19nm. Voila, professional troubleshooting. But then the real question is, what is the significance? What is the impact? On smuggling, how many chips is too many? So according to the most recent quantitative estimate from SemiAnalysis, they report that they estimate that roughly 350,000 chips have been smuggled to China. What does that mean? Is that too many? So ChatGPT-4 required roughly 25,000 chips to produce. So China may now have access to produce or train large-scale frontier models. But at the same time, semiconductor manufacturing capacity for US and allied nations is increasing, so the relative compute gap might still be growing. Then the second point is that we tend to think that the choke points for equipment and all that is quite foolproof, but with what I've said about entity lists, it might not be perfectly foolproof. So that's the second point. But at the same time, I think we need to acknowledge that in the short term, the US has indeed kneecapped China. So if you look at the production of the second series of Huawei's SN900 series, they are only marginally better than the first generation. So it does seem the past 2 years, China has not made much progress. But I think the real results will be seen in the next 1 to 2 years. I think 2 years was far too short a time frame to evaluate them.
Excellent perspective. Now, Greg makes a strong case around the resources needed for BIS to enforce this. Did you have some thoughts on this? Including, Let me just ask you, just to prompt you here, about US collaboration or coordination with other partners.
Absolutely. So Greg has written extensively about this, and I think he's completely right. BIS is too lean, it's overstretched, and I think Greg proposed a modest 50 billion additional budget. But for me, the thing is that despite all the focus on how topical export controls have become, none of this has been forthcoming. And it's very clear that when you have enforcement officers in the double digits, this is nowhere enough to sort of deal with the challenges of smuggling. So if I take that as the premise is that we're not going to be able to change this much, what do we do? So on the first part, I think you need to be more focused. So for smuggling, maybe detecting all chip smuggling operations might be too much. Let's focus on the more important choke points, which I think are equipment, repair and service components, software. I think you need to be clear-eyed that in the short term, it's not just about preventing China from having access to chips. You want to prevent them from being able to produce these chips at scale. It's really about being able to cripple their long-term technological production capacities. So that's the first thing, being sort of focused. The second one is that the way BIS is set up is this is not just a cat and mouse game, this is a whack and maul game. And the way the dynamics of the game are set up is that BIS is almost set up to fail. You cannot possibly, like Greg has said, 10x scaling for smuggling operations, and BIS has not grown. And so you need to have a reorientation. Instead of just reactive blacklisting, you need to be more proactive. And so in my paper, I come up with some recommendations for how to think about them. So the first one, how do we increase this sort of detection enforcement loop? And how do you maybe shaft some liability onto suppliers and sellers? So I propose a certification program for sellers, and that if they're found to be wanting or negligent, they lose their certification to sell these very valuable chips. And then also when at the process of sale, you need to have a digital waybill so we can track what are the chains of custody as the chips move through potential suppliers and smugglers. And then they need to declare at the point of purchase which shipping provider they're going to use, because a lot of smugglers tend to use sort of private couriers. They don't want to use the UPS and FedExes because they tend to have very extensive sort of screening technologies, and they're less pliable to bribery, let's say that. And so that is one thing, and that improves the sort of detection enforcement loop. And then these logistics providers have to report to BIS every 2 to 4 weeks on packages they haven't received. And so now BIS is not just trying to go and find leads, the leads are coming to them. And this is very important if you're lean and overstretched. The last one is the international piece. So it doesn't matter how well BIS does on its own if their partners are not trying to do enough. And then your compliance sieve becomes very leaky at the margins. And I think the current problem is that the US wants partners to do a lot more to mirror the controls, but this is a step too far for partners. But partners also at the same time, if they're realizing that if they don't do enough, the US is going to muscle in on them in bilateral, trilateral settings, and they're going to be forced to do more than they want to. So my question and my proposal for many of them, what is the highest common denominator approach? The US might not get everything they want, but on aggregate, we improve export control compliance. And for partners as well, they get to be more valued and helpful allied partners. So those are the three things I think that are points for improvement.
That's very, very helpful, both of you, in terms of laying out what the pathway forward is for export controls, both capabilities of government, but also the effectiveness of enforcement, really quite valuable. But you've also reminded us as we were doing this report that those are necessary but not sufficient, meaning if the larger goal of US competition or US competitiveness is what we have to keep in mind, ultimately we have to be able to out-innovate our competitors, in particular and principally China, across a number of advanced technologies. In some we are far ahead, in others not so much. But what is very clear is it's a moving target. The Chinese have significant industrial strategies. Other competitors and allies have their own industrial strategies. And so it comes to this question of what we're doing around these promote policies. So you've talked about protect, let's move to promote. And I want to go to Sujay because you've been pretty close to the CHIPS program in terms of monitoring it, commenting on it, analyzing how it's evolving. You kind of make a really interesting case here about what is needed to finish the swing on CHIPS. There's an ongoing question and debate about should there be a CHIPS 2.0? What does that look like? There's a relatively broad conversation, bipartisan, around what the forward path is. And you comment on this, including in the essay about research cooperation, the role of tech hubs, the role of clusters as an important engine for innovation and scaling. And so I'd wonder if you could just comment on that and tell us where do you see us today with CHIPS and where do you see us going forward?
So let me just start with the point that Greg made. I think it was an extremely momentous decision and a strategic shift to move from cooperation with China to actively try to impede their progress. But in order to, and that has, as you mentioned, had an impact on the Chinese. But this is not a static industry. It's an industry that continues to drive at the cadence of Moore's law. So every 2 years, there is a new generation of faster and more proficient chips going on. So we have to keep moving at that rate. If we are to make advantage, we have tripped them. But while they're getting up and they're mobilizing their innovation ecosystem, not only to compensate for advancement in the lower node chips, but across the whole spectrum of semiconductors and other advanced technologies. We have a small window to actually accelerate our ability to improve our ecosystem, to improve our innovation capacity, and move forward. Are we exploiting that opportunity? And the CHIPS and Science Act is in many ways a companion to the BIS export control initiatives, but there are some problems with that in the sense that the government has moved expeditiously to allocate the funds to a variety of semiconductor companies to build fabrication plants in the United States. They have started to build these tech hubs and microelectronic commons hubs, as well as NSF engines, to create the networks that can further grow out the innovation ecosystem. Question is, do we have the political will and the financial continuity to make sure that these initiatives stay the course. Because you can't fund, you can't just pass chips and science and say that, okay, we've checked that off, we're done with this, we can move on to other topics. This is something that is an engagement that has to be decades long if we are to actually win and prevail in this competitive race, which is so important for our economic and national security. So in terms of, just chips and science is important. A lot of it still, the money still hasn't moved. So that is the first priority in terms of making sure that, companies like Intel and others who have been promised amounts to get their work accelerated, that reaches them. A lot of the activities in terms of getting agencies like NSF to double their scope so that they can provide more of the basic research, the other parts of the innovation landscape that are necessary to maintain our speed. That has not been funded. So there's chips and science has provided a lot of the important posts that we need to be working on. We need continuity and we need follow through.
Got it. So let me just ask a follow on here, just so people understand. When we say we're investing and we need to fund them, you're talking about public investment in things like, for example, firm-specific, company-specific incentives, like the ones for manufacturing incentives for locating fabs in the U.S. There's also funding for R&D. There's also funding for the development of hubs, which are basically consortia of companies, universities, state and local, working on different technologies. So some of it is chips, others are renewables, others are biotech. This is what you're talking about.
Yep.
And they're working together to identify how could you make this locale attractive for investments to grow R&D commercialization. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah. So
how are we doing at this stage?
Yeah. So if you take any locality, they have usually a number of existing assets. They have universities. Sometimes they may have federal labs, DOE or DoD labs. They have firms and workforce and vocational colleges. Very often the incentives and the connections across these existing assets are very poor. If, for example, in some communities, the community colleges aren't aligned with the needs of industry. So the funding for vocational schools is often set by the state, and that performance varies across states and regions. So if your community college is funded on the basis of just pure enrollment, then the incentive for the community college is not to create specialized programs that feed into the needs of local businesses. It's to fill seats. So you have to make sure that the connective tissue, the incentive alignments, are in place across a whole variety of parameters. So what these hubs and other types of connective tissue, if you can call them that, do is to create the focal points where different actors can make sure that their incentives are aligned so that they work more cohesively. Another example is entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs may have a new idea, and the question is, how do you convince a venture capitalist or a bank to fund your idea? So there's a knowledge gap there, or knowledge asymmetry. So again, how do you create public-private partnerships? These are neither public nor private. These are hybrid organizations that create the information that venture capitalists and others can use to invest in this. So if you look at local ecosystems, regional ecosystems, there are a whole series of challenges at the local level, and each of these regional ecosystems is then networked into what was other regional and as well as international ecosystems. So the question is, how do you create the effective connected regional ecosystems that are much more efficient at solving their problems and creating and moving ideas from the lab or from the idea stage through to the scale-up stage to manufacturing. Yeah. So that is the intellectual challenge that these hubs and engines and so forth are trying to solve.
Excellent. Well, what's very interesting is that these are dispersed across the country. And I think that there seems to be pretty much a bipartisan consensus that there have been people and places left behind over the last 40 years. and that if there is to be a promote agenda around industries, it needs to solve for that. And I think that you have people in red states and blue states and all kinds of places across the country who would agree that that's something one should look into. And if I look at the numbers, at least the government cites $450 billion in private sector investment commitments in chips that have been made. You said no money has gone out the door, very little money has gone out the door, but the policy has signaled that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to ask one question, then I'm going to come to Joseph, who's been very patient, which is, we have heard in many cases that workforce is a binding constraint on these investments actually sticking and us delivering on the promise of the CHIPS program, or in the case of IRA, the clean tech agenda, which Joseph will speak about. How do you see that?
So the workforce issue has to be kind of split into two parts of the problem. The first is the high skill part of it, and there is a lot of effort going on to help to educate women, minorities, and bring other parts of our population, improve our S&T education system.
Science and technology.
Science and technology, but that's more of a generational challenge. We need those people, today. And what is happening is that this workforce is now internationally competitive. There's an international competition for those sets of skills. We are, whether intentionally or unintentionally, binding ourselves in this competition because our immigration system is not geared to engage ourselves internationally in that competition. So we need to solve that ASAP. And unfortunately, that has gotten tied up politically with the broader immigration issue. We need to separate that and make sure that we are competitive, that we solve that issue as soon as possible. The other issue is the skilled technical workforce, what used to be called the blue collar or the middle skilled workforce. There, I would refer you back to the description I was making a little bit earlier in terms of these are the education of this part of the workforce segment is largely in our system a state and local responsibility. Right. And so those alignments that I was mentioning in terms of state policies, favoring funding for vocational schools that target, vocational schools that are focused on providing the skills that industry needs. It's unfortunately a lot of the debate has been focused on either on community colleges for all or apprenticeships. Now, apprenticeships work only in certain narrow conditions. If you have a large employer who has the scale to actually train people, then the people who you train are pretty much going to be working in your company, and so you are able to then be at least nominally altruistic. If you are in an industry situation where you have a number of small industries, I take the onus on training my worker. There's no guarantee that he or she may not go over to the company across the street and develop a career there. So in those cases, you do need public-private partnerships to align industries. So you have a consortium of local industries that partner with the community college to provide the platform training, and then the firm provides the last centimeter of that training. Mm-hmm. So you have a series of different types of local solutions. It varies depending on the industry, it varies depending on the state and local situations, but this is, again, something that you see examples, really fantastic examples of this in different parts of the country, but you need to have much more of this going on.
Thank you.
Can I actually jump in quickly?
Please jump in, yes.
I've learned a lot from Sujay on this point. When we were working on the implementation of the U.S. Hydrogen Hubs program now a couple of years ago, Sujay helped my program think about how does that federal program address these regional workforce development needs by creating stacked credentials so people can enter the workforce without 2 years of training, but at 6 months. Mm-hmm. And how do you use the sort of federal architecture, in this case from the DOE, to sort of harmonize those credentialing programs such that one hydrogen hub may be regionalized in the Gulf. It has its own economic model, its own feedstocks, its own customers. There might be another in California, which is accomplishing a variety of other goals or taking another technology pathway. But by and large, like the people who are learning how to pipe fit hydrogen or learning how to work in that industry, and there's 24 jobs that need to be specially credentialed. they could move in between those two relatively quickly, right? That's like it's a really interesting role for the federal government to play in supporting regional efforts by kind of laying a base.
Yes.
That was a really valuable contribution. And to the extent the DOE has taken it up, it entirely rests on our shoulders.
Well, let's broaden this conversation from where you sit. I took at least two things away from what you wrote and what you've been writing. Right. One is that energy is an important enabler for a lot of the industrial strategy efforts we're undertaking, whether it's on chips, God knows for AI and data centers, which is work that you're doing right now with Bharat, for other industries. So energy is a critical enabler, and you've written about this around manufacturing and its energy needs. Yeah. And so I want you to hit on that. But then there's also climate tech and clean tech as a objective of industrial strategy under the Inflation Reduction Act. So could you give us your views on these two things and how they're evolving and what is ahead of us in terms of the next few years, including your recommendations for the next administration?
Completely. If I may, let me start with the big picture.
Yes.
So for the last 20 years, the U.S. has somewhat surprisingly been a leader in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in particular from the power sector. We cut emissions off their peak from our power sector by about 40% since over the last 20 years. Over that same period, growth in the power sector was minuscule, 1% or below in many years. At the same time, we developed this fantastic shale industry. It created energy security, and it really demonstrates profoundly the connection between energy security and economic security. Right? If we can produce a lot of fossil fuel energy, that reduces price volatility. It reduces the power of cartels of producers abroad. And the challenge that we now find ourselves in, if you look at those kind of three mega trends, is if we want to make these reinvestments into the American economy, if we want to compete, if we want to secure supply chains, if we want to have a leadership position on AI, all that's going to take energy. So the positive story we're coming at it from the last 20 years has to face a sort of new qualitative reality. The way in which we were able to reduce emissions and start responding to the climate challenge benefited from the fact that there was very little growth in the power sector. So you could build a bunch of renewables and you were closing coal plants at the same time, and those things could largely balance. Mm-hmm. Now we're in a world where if we're going to have a leading semiconductor factory in Arizona, that's 200 megawatts of near constant power draw. When it's fully expressed, it'll be nearly a gigawatt. That's a large nuclear reactor equivalent energetic need. It costs billions of dollars to do that. And the fundamental question, the problem we face, I think facing policymakers, where energy becomes an enabler of this agenda, is to build all of the things we want to build to be economically competitive. We're going to need to be able to provide energy. And we're then going to face some decisions. How do we do that in a way that allows for continued progress on climate, that allows for affordability, particularly in the electricity sector, and allows us to continue benefiting from the natural resources that have enabled the progress we've made over the last 20 years. That's where we get to the recommendations in the piece. We see a really significant role for the federal government in supporting large-scale electricity transmission. That's often seen, like people have a view of that stuff, that infrastructure, as being just like long, huge power lines you see when you're driving on highways. But they are like really engines of economic progress and economic security. And we think we need to reframe how the federal government thinks about those. There's a significant role for the federal government in enabling new nuclear build-out. We've all seen the headlines. Data center companies are restarting dilapidated nuclear reactors, but there's only so much capacity that can be re-added. We're going to need to build new, and that means we're going to be able to need to do it faster and cheaper if it's going to make a significant contribution. And the U.S. government has a real role to play both on the innovation side as well as on the regulatory reform side so that new technologies can get to market faster. Lastly, the role of natural gas is probably the one that is the most politically vexing, because natural gas is if you're a utility planner, natural gas is an easy thing to go to when you need to add new load, new generation to meet new demand. It's predictable, it's relatively inexpensive, and for the past 25 years, it's been a cleaner option than a lot of what you were already using, coal plants particularly. But if you look at the long-term climate agenda, this does raise some questions, because if you're building a new gas-powered facility today, you're probably going to want to be using that 30 years from now. And the climate goals that have been set by the Biden administration and many states share make it tough to imagine that you're going to still be using that 30 years from now. And so we've come up with a series of recommendations, thinking really carefully about how do we balance the most urgent needs that we face today with our long-term climate imperatives. And in particular, in the case of natural gas, how are we going to use it or exploit that resource in the power sector, either using carbon capture and storage technologies, which are not quite ready for commercial development, but are very close, or kind of changing the way power markets work. The federal government has a role in articulating both of those solutions as well.
Excellent. I'm going to come back to Greg here, because you wear many hats here, and particularly on AI and the AI revolution. I was wondering if you could comment on this question around the energy requirements of the AI revolution. It's some work that the team is starting to work on, but it would be interested in your perspective.
Sure. So I think to begin, when we use AI, we experience it as software. But all AI software has to run on semiconductor hardware somewhere. So when you're accessing it through the cloud, you're going to a data center. Those data centers convert electricity into computational force. And unfortunately, they are incredibly energy intensive at the current stage. There's a lot of new data centers going up. It's totally routine for those data centers to be tens of megawatts. Now we're coming up on data centers that are going to be hundreds of megawatts. And the biggest AI companies are talking about data centers, or at least groups of data centers, that might be at the gigawatt scale.
And again, that's a large nuclear reactor.
Yeah, I think a useful point of comparison is that ballpark numbers, the entire electrical generation capacity of the entire United States of America right now is 1,250 gigawatts. Well, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan gave a speech here in Washington, D.C. I had the privilege of attending last week, in which he announced a new AI national security memorandum. And in the speech where he was outlining that new thing, which by the way had a very large section on energy, had a very long section about immigration reform, specifically including both AI talent and semiconductor talent, that memorandum, when he was announcing that speech, he directed the Office of the White House Chief of Staff and the Department of Energy and a host of other interagencies to try and get their hands around permitting reform and other things that they can accelerate the build out of massive new electrical generation capacity, all because of AI. And the number that Jake Sullivan threw out there was tens or hundreds of gigawatts. So we're going from a world where 5 years ago, AI was literally nothing on the electrical generation grid of the United States as a consumer, to a very plausible scenario where folks like the US National Security Advisor are envisioning a world where by the end of this decade, AI might be 10% of US electricity demand or 20% of US electricity demand. This is all changing so fast, and these issues, as we've said, and part of the reason for this discussion is that they're so interconnected.
Fascinating.
Can I add to
Please,
that?
yes.
So I think Greg is completely right. We've seen an exponential increase in the amount of computing resources to train frontier AI models. And the first person to identify this was Dario Amodei. He was then at OpenAI. He would then go to co-found Anthropic, which is one of the leading AI labs. And he published a paper, actually a blog post in 2018. And he said that if you were to plot AI capabilities on the y-axis and the amount of GPUs or computing power on the y-axis, we see a near linear trend from 2012 to 2018. And he found that from just 2012 to 2018, we see an explosive increase of 300,000 times of computing power required. Now, analogously, that's the difference between a Hyundai engine and a jet propulsion engine. I mean, that's like, it's not a minor incremental upgrade. There's a completely different realm of capability. And this was in the early days of deep learning. And that trend has only accelerated since then. And we've seen very stable scaling laws. So compute has increased roughly by 4 to 5 times every year. That doesn't sound like a lot. But if we need 50,000 GPUs today, then next year we need 250,000. And then it's 1.25 million, 6.25 million, 31.25, 156.25. I will not embarrass my math any further by making any hiccups. But we start to see, and some people have estimated by 2030 we're going to require 20 million H100 equivalents, how many data centers will that require? And so like Greg mentioned, like the demands that currently AI data centers contribute about roughly 3% of total electricity consumption. And based on some estimates, this might go up to 10, 15%. And that's just enormous. And our strained energy infrastructure might not be able to keep up. But I'll hand over to Joseph.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is exactly the question that we're facing when you think about energy as an enabler. Like we've heard from companies, and you see the announcements in the press, 2026, 2027, we're not going to be able to add new data centers in the locations we want them, at least, because of energetic constraints. And as Greg mentioned, the solutions around permitting reform and other things can probably help speed it up. But it is going to be a particular challenge because remember, at the same time that we have this explosion in AI use, we also want to be reshoring manufacturing. It'd be nice if we could make aluminum in this country for a lot of people. Right. And we are witnessing a broader trend of electrification of the economy. Mm-hmm. The light duty vehicle fleet, the arrival of electric vehicles, electric appliances, those are tied to both consumer preferences and the climate agenda. And so we might find ourselves in the next few years in a place where electrons, but particularly clean electrons, are a little bit tough to come by. Mm-hmm. And that's going to require some policy treatment.
Yes, and so when one steps back from this, welcome your thoughts on this, is that not only the accelerant that the AI revolution is, but across the different industrial strategies that we are undertaking, clean tech, climate tech, quantum is coming. You're doing some work on that. Biopharma, you're doing some work on that. All of you are doing work on the AI piece. The demands on enablers, energy, workforce, capital or strategic capital will be significant. And so the trade-offs will become starker and starker as we go forward. And I think that you shed a light on that in the essays that you've highlighted. I think that going forward beyond that, there could be spillovers on export controls because there are new technologies that policymakers may be looking at. And so really the system is being pushed in significant ways. One area that I know we touched on in the essay, but we're going to do some more work on is what does it take to be well organized around industrial strategy for the US? Because I think you've talked about how we're in a new world in which government and markets and how they work together is really being rethought relative to the last 40 years.
So could I jump in on this point?
Please.
So if you were to hypothetically go into the US government in the year 1960 and say, I need to talk to an oil expert or I need to talk to an energy expert, whether you're going to the intelligence community or the various departments, I think you'd actually have a pretty hard time finding the degree of expertise in the government that you could find in the private sector. And I think it was the Arab oil embargo that really woke this country up to the reality of energy security and how if you don't have enough oil, your economy is going to starve in really painful ways. And so now today, if you go to the CIA, you can find a lot of oil experts. If you go to the Department of Energy, you can find a lot of world-class oil experts. And I think it was really the COVID pandemic that woke up the US government to the need for this in so many different technological domains.
Yes.
So the Department of Commerce, folks may remember the semiconductor supply chain crisis that was brought about during the COVID pandemic when auto manufacturers, for example, could not finish making their cars because they could make every component, but they didn't have the chips to put inside. Right. And modern cars need hundreds or thousands of chips. Well, the Department of Commerce estimates that just that supply chain shortage of semiconductors shaved a full percentage point off of US GDP. Yeah. And we're an economy that in a good year grows 3%. So to cut GDP growth by half or a third just because of a shortage of semiconductors, I think that really woke up the US government. Mm-hmm. That in the same way that we needed to master energy security and we needed real locuses of competence and expertise inside the government around energy topics, well, now we need that in semiconductor topics, but really in technology value chains as a whole. And economic security as a whole. I think there has been this waking up moment, whether it's the challenges with Russia and China or the COVID supply chain crisis, or just an awareness of how fast technologies like AI are moving, the government is recognizing that they need to be good at different things that they used to be good
I think
at.
that's eloquently stated. I'm going to go ahead, Sujay.
No, I think you're quite right. The pandemic was sort of a wake-up moment, not only for policymakers, but for the public as well. Previously, nobody knew what a semiconductor was. People were feverishly typing texts into their cell phones, but they didn't know what a semiconductor was. Today, the situation is quite different. The Chips and Science Act has really kind of accelerated our thinking as well as activity on the public and private sector on a whole series of these things. I mean, if you're trying to build, large-scale fabrication plants for semiconductors, it's putting a lot of pressure on a whole series of infrastructural needs in terms of the workforce, in terms of permitting, in terms of power grids, and we are now sort of moving more or less on all of these fronts at the same time. That's a good thing, because I think for the past 3 decades, perhaps more, we have been offshoring our manufacturing. We've been getting, at least for a period of time, the China price, but that also took us off the hook in terms of making sure that our environmental laws were up to speed in terms of supporting development of infrastructure and manufacturing. It offshored our manufacturing muscle. We didn't have to train our workforce. We didn't have to worry about that, because the Chinese were taking care of that. So we are now in a process of hurry up and catch up. And so this piece of legislation at the federal level is now spurring a lot of activity at the private sector, as well as we tend to think of public and private as sort of two different things. But if you actually look across the United States, there's a whole series of institutional flora and fauna that sort of span both. And what we are looking in terms of hubs or other types of public-private hybrid, government or hybrid organizations are now filling out that ecosystem. It's becoming a much more rich and robust set of dynamics that you see locally. You see the really very robust participation from the private sector because they see the opportunity there. But a lot of that has to then work hand in glove with making sure that the infrastructure to expand is also present. So our growth, our economic security is very much predicated on our ability to expand. That means that our infrastructure capacity has to expand. And so this is a virtuous cycle that we have now undertaken. The question is, from a policy perspective, we need to maintain the emphasis, the pace, the cadence to make sure that this ball that has now been set in motion continues to roll and become bigger.
I think that's well stated. Let me just go back to Greg's piece, because you've kind of broadened the picture, which is really important. But Greg hit something important. I want to make sure that Joseph has a chance to comment on this, which is that I experienced this when I was in government, seeing the rapid buildup of the CHIPS team, who have 2 types of experience at least. They have technology expertise. They also have deal-making expertise from the private sector, which is something that didn't exist in the federal government. I understand that the DOE loan office has something similar. Yeah. And there's a real bigger question here, because what we're talking about across government and the private sector is in effect raising the bar, in both the private and public sectors, for the type of capabilities that are needed to hit the mark. And so maybe if you could comment on whether have I hit the mark, or am I missing something here in terms of what Greg just said?
I think we're at the beginning of a process here in terms of the federal government reinvigorating its tools for industrial policy, economic statecraft, et cetera, right? It's like if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, the modal position would have been pork barrel politics, or what you get when you try to do industrial policy. And that's really turned on a dime. And that I don't think that's a partisan statement either. I think there's real bipartisan interest if you look at who's voted for the bills, even some of the continuity between the Trump and Biden administration on some of this stuff. There is a real shift in Washington's thinking. The challenge is we don't have a lot of muscle memory for it, right? Like, good industrial policy is a severe process. You have to be willing to tell vested interests no.
Right.
You have to be willing to say we're choosing this, not that. And that is a difficult thing to do in a democracy.
Yeah.
It's a difficult thing for our agencies to do when they feel it's their job to uplift every regional innovation center. And I think one of the most, and it's a difficult thing to do when people are entering into that conversation with different motivations, right?
And in our polarized
time.
political time.
Right.
yes.
Yeah. I mean, it falls down to even the kind of clean hydrogen you want to make is suddenly a partisan statement in
Right.
quarters of Washington.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the problem of pork barrel politics, which, as you said, was the constant refrain anytime anybody said the word industrial policy.
There was a whole book called Pork Barrel
Yes.
Politics.
But when you come to the not the AI hubs, the chip hubs in the CHIPS Act, you know, if you talk to Taiwan, they say America already blew it, right? By trying to spread the money around too much, when really what you need is something roughly a Taiwan-sized region of your country where everybody knows everybody and suppliers don't have to build the same facility in Arizona and Ohio to serve the customers in Arizona and Ohio. They can just build one, facility. So I do think that we constantly, as you get into industrial policy, the government has to make tough choices. And sometimes splitting the difference between choice A and choice B and going in the middle, sometimes that's worse than either choice A or choice B. But in a democracy, it's really hard because you're trying to make everybody happy.
I know we got a few minutes left before we get cut off, so make a quick intervention and then I want to just pick up this last thread.
No, I think redundancy is actually a strength. We need to actually be competitive. We need to have different regions because you don't know what's going to be successful at the end. And Taiwan has its model, and we are a much bigger country. We need to have several models, and I think there's nothing wrong with that.
That's a fair point. I think that one thing that we will want to work on over the next year, and this is a plug for some of the work we're going to do, is how we organize ourselves for industrial strategy. And certainly you've hit the point, which is that what is an American version of this that makes sense for our politics and for our set of goals and for our system of governance? And certainly in the boisterous democracy that we have, you simply can't do this without somebody or some set of institutions calling balls and strikes on what's working and what's not working. And I think that our hope is that our team is able to add our little contribution to that, but certainly the U.S. as a whole needs to figure out what that is. And so it's that itself is going to be a source of debate and discussion. And I'm glad that we've kind of touched on some of that today and in the essay, because that's going to be the basis for going forward. And it brings me back to where we started, which is that all of this economic security, policy, innovation, and ferment really was motivated by trying to address these three goals that I started out with 2 hours ago now, which is an accelerating global technology competition across a number of technologies, 5 Sputnik moments, not one. 2 is significant economic dislocation in our country over the last 40 years that we have to address. Otherwise, why are we doing this? And then 3, the world is changing with climate change and pandemics, and we experienced that head on with the pandemic, and we're experiencing that with climate change. We have to address all these 3 to effectively be economically secure. And through time, meaning not just today, but for another generation or 2. And I think that's the spirit in which we offered this essay, and hopefully will be the beginning of a strategic research agenda over the next several years for the Economic Security and Technology Department. And with that, I want to thank everybody for joining and thank the group here and the team that joined in the first part of the session. Super, super excited to be part of this team and what we're going to do going forward. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.